It's patch day. Let's break down all the changes to Marvel Snap in this OTA. First up is a nerf to the move list. One of the best decks in Marvel Snap. Sparky is gaining a power in his stats, but losing a power in his ability. And the way move plays out, it is much more likely that the power in his ability lost is not offset by the power gained in his stats. Now, the reason for this is largely related to Human Torch, but there are a couple of other things influencing this take. The first and most important is, of course, that Human Torch scales off of the power that it has. Giving more power to Human Torch with a Sparky is going to be better because that means you are doubling larger amounts. So this should largely take a little bit of the top off of the move deck. That said, I don't think it'll be a massive change to how the move deck actually functions because, generally speaking, Human Torch is going to get to the point that it is quite large and quite in charge whenever you handle it. A lot of the move deck's power is wrapped up in Human Torch, and while this does take a little bit off the top, what really matters is getting to a breakpoint of power with the card that it basically contests any lane. That number is somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 most likely, and so as long as you get in that range, it doesn't really matter if you're at 32 or 64, as long as your opponent is below that number. That's why I don't think this is going to be the most impactful change. I also think that the difference between 2-1 and 2-2 is actually quite minimal. Like, yeah, in a sense, this is an increase of power in a meaningful way to a cheap card. I don't think that applies to what Sparky is, though, because Sparky is effectively just a card that you play for the text box. The stats on it are not really something that matter, and until it starts getting stats that start mattering and a text box that can be played outside of full combo setups, I don't really think that I care about the additional power that it's being given here. This is, to me, fairly clearly a nerf, despite it being generally a sort of rework or redistribution of the power in it. Now, Sparky is still going to be played in these decks most likely. He does become a little bit less of a major part of them, but what I found the most interesting about the way they wrote these notes was that they implied that this was not a situation they were happy with. Not necessarily the power level of move, but the power distribution within the move deck, i.e. so much of it being relative to Human Torch, so much of the deck being about Human Torch, and so little of the deck being about really anything else. And I think that's a correct way to approach this. Is move too strong? Maybe. Is it imbalanced in a way that isn't particularly fun because so much of its power is one guy? I would say that is a meaningful problem they should try to address before simply just balancing the deck to be worse. Because if you don't address that problem, at some point you're going to make more new cards that make this kind of deck good again, and you'll have the exact same problem where 80% of the deck's power is this one card, and everything is judged by how it relates to this one card because that's where the power is. And I think sort of that's where Sparky falls here. So much of this card is wrapped up in Human Torch, and they probably do have more problem solving that they will have to do in order to make move a more palatable, interesting, and dynamic deck. Storm is losing a point of power down to 3-1. Now, obviously, this does impact the Storm War Machine Legion decks that I do think, to me, have been pretty underrated by higher level players, and I would imagine lower level players watching this are like, what are you talking about, man? That's super busted and they should have gotten rid of it a long time ago. I do think that this is also a meaningful nerf to Cerebro 2, in as much as there is such a thing as a meaningful nerf to Cerebro 2, because it takes away location control from a deck where location control is genuinely paramount. I think that this is the kind of change where it's a reasonable thing to do. Putting an additional tax on running this card is notable, but it sort of just makes me wonder if they should just rework Storm, because Storm is this iconic and amazing character, and I don't like that she is sort of pigeonholed into this kind of archetype where it's like, if she's ever good, they're gonna hit some part of what makes her good pretty consistently. whether it be making her not work with War Machine Legion by her cost, or the shorter, smaller version of this, which is to say, making sure that she is so prohibitively cheap that it just ends up not being worth doing what you're doing with her. Now, I do think that 3-1 does provide a couple of interesting opportunities here. Like, obviously, she's not necessarily the greatest target for something like a polymorph because you aren't able to know what that power is going to be. But the weaker she is, the more relative value you are getting by transforming her. That kind of thing does come to mind. I think the biggest thing for me, though, is I wish she wasn't held back by her interactions with War Machine and Legion. And I do think that of those 3 cards, she is definitely the one you want to nerf, right? You'd rather leave the other 2 alone. They do other stuff. She kind of only does this stuff. And when she does this stuff, you obviously want to force multiply it. So the problem is her. I just sort of wish this card wasn't Storm. One of the coolest and most iconic characters in Marvel Snap is sort of interestingly in the same spot as something like Jean Grey, where this is an iconic, amazing X-Men heroine and does something that is so restrictive to other people being able to enjoy the game that she has to be kept on a very tight leash. I wish that wasn't the case with this card, and I wish that wasn't the case notably with Jean Grey as well, where it's like these are cards that you could make stronger, but you'd probably be making the game worse if you did. And I respect that. And it still makes me sad that they had to do this. Zombie Galacti getting a buff. Now, I do know that Jay Walla has been really messing around with Zombie Galacti type of things. I have been relatively impressed with what he's gotten to, but what's interesting to me is most of what he's gotten to kind of involves Khonshu type stuff. There's been some other stuff that is like, all right, Shuri type stuff with this card. I do think it's very clear that this is one of, if not the worst build-arounds in the entirety of Marvel Snap. I also still worry that, like, they mention in the notes they think 1 point of power is a big deal to this card, and it probably is. But I worry that they'll be like, well, we were just wrong about 1 point of power being a big deal because it'll go from like 35% win rate to 40% win rate. And that's a pretty big jump. And then they'll be like, well, what if we made it a 6 cost and then I'll hate it forever? So please don't do that, Marvel Snap. But largely, this card has problems that are related to both its own output and the hoops you have to jump through. But I do think that it has become sort of in vogue to be like, this card is unplayable garbage. And they probably, like, it kind of is, but fundamentally what it is doing is actually quite a powerful thing that is really only held back by the numbers on it. What I am interested in is the best versions of this list that I've seen are various things that have been played pretty much exclusively at high infinite. There are just a couple of one tricks who are just like really dedicated to being like, all right, I'm going to play this garbage and see if there's anything real in there. And I don't know that I would say there's a good deck in there, but I will say there's probably a better deck in there than 99% of people give it credit for. So I'm just not necessarily sounding an early alarm on this. I'm just letting you know that there is specifically like one guy who is playing this at high infinite, and it's not nearly as bad as people are giving it credit for being that bad. I do think the card still sucks, but I do think that this is the kind of thing where it's like, I think on the whole, there's a perception gap between how strong the card actually is and how strong the card is perceived to be. And that perception gap is largely due to the fact that people picked up this card. It did not work for them. They never played it again. And I do think that since the time that this card came out, Zombie Galacti decks have gotten better and better and better. And I wouldn't say that they're good yet, but I would say that there's a pretty meaningful gap between what people perceive this card as and what it actually is. I'm not saying that this is necessarily going to do that, but I wouldn't be surprised if this became like, you know, something that like a Binks or a Regis did a video on in a few weeks, and you're like, oh no, there's actually like, I could do this. I wouldn't be shocked if it got to that level. And that's probably a good space for it to be, because I really don't want it to be above that level. Orka getting a buff up to effectively 18 power if he's your only card in a lane. Long overdue. I really have nothing bad to say about this. The thing is for 6 drops that it is such an ask for them to be the only card you play on the final turn of the game that when you're doing something that has an additional restriction, like having it be the only card in that lane, you need to get paid off like this. I do think it is an interesting comparison to Destroyer, by which I mean I kind of think Destroyer should have like 22 power, but I'm just happy they're doing something to make these guys meaningfully bigger. I am not going to lie, I can absolutely see a metagame where I would want to play Orka. It is not this metagame, which is very combo-centric and all of that, but I can see a world where like, oh, you know, let's say I'm like, you know, I'm Wiccan gaming, there's some spells in my deck. It's worth pointing out that the more skills they make that have meaningful impacts on the board, the better a card like this gets, because it is not restricting you so much as it would be if you were, for example, giving up on actually playing cards in order to make sure the effect goes off. Again, not saying we're going to be in an Orka meta anytime soon, but I am saying, like, look, if I were playing something like a Wiccan deck and I didn't have First Steps Galactus, I would kind of think about playing Orka as the budget replacement now. I might be. It might be you should just be playing Magneto instead. I totally buy that, but it is the kind of thing where this card is totally not on my radar, and a couple points of power, it's like, you know, 18, that's quite the number. Now, granted, I don't think I'm going to be playing a lot of Wiccan stuff that curves into 6-drops. That's just not where I'm at right now. But if I were, this could be a thing. Odin going up to 6'9", just in time for 69 to leave the public consciousness as the funny number in favor of 6'7". That's a shame for Odin, because I don't think this is a meaningful change to his power level in any kind of real way. It's just the kind of thing that represents where the game is at, and also not just power creep over the course of the game, but power creep within the subset of Series 1 cards. We just talked about a few days ago how there are going to be new decks entering Series 1, cards like Mystique, cards like Thanos. They're not literally entering Series 1, but if you log on for those 28 days, there's going to be people in Series 1 playing them, probably. Ultron, things of that nature. It means the card like Odin has a lot more to compete with. This point of power is a good thing. I think it is almost totally irrelevant to anything Odin is actually doing in the real game, which is a very limited amount of things. But I suppose it's nice if you're playing some sort of Wong Hazmat Odin deck and you feel the need to do that in the year 2025, which, to be clear, you should not. This is not a change that will be a meaningful anything in any kind of situation. 6'8", 6'9", not something that super matters. You are investing in this card for the text in it, and frankly, it's still below rate. Like, if they went like 6'8" to 6'12", then suddenly you'd start seeing more Odins, but that's just not really the kind of designers they seem to be. So this is a very safe change that is just one of those, this card could use a point of power, and might as well try to keep some of our old staples up. I don't want to make it sound like this is a bad thing for them to do, because I want them to do this. I want them to do changes like this that are just like, here's a free point of power. There's just really not a lot else to say about it. Wave up to 3/6, I think, is interesting for two reasons. The first is it feels a little overdue when you compare something like Luna Snow to Wave. It feels a little overdue that, like, Wave gets that 3/6 stat line. I think people are used to thinking of 3/6 as like a stat line that cannot be done. I think Luna Snow's whole journey demonstrated that in certain cases it needs to be done when effects are symmetrical if you want those effects to see play. The other thing this does, though, and I think this is pretty interesting, when you're doing like Wave Galactus stuff, Wave's body matters quite a bit because you really want priority so your Galactus goes off before whatever big thing they played gets to be revealed, right? That matters. Like, I'm not saying this is like the world's biggest Galactus buff of all time, but that specific playline of Wave into Galactus gets a lot stronger when she's at 6. Like, this is the kind of place where a breakpoint like that is really important. There are people who are running around playing a lot of 3/5s. There aren't nearly so many 3/6s, and if you put her in a lane, she will be bigger than basically any 1-drop, bigger than basically any 2-drop. She will make you win that lane. When you're winning 2 lanes, you have priority. You kind of see where I'm going with this. Is it the world's most incredible change? No. But I do think that in this specific case, this point of power that she is getting is actually quite a relevant point of power in the context of Wave Galactus and the things that she typically does. Is that enough to make Wave Galactus a super popular and playable deck? Well, I will say this. I think Galactus is actually quite well positioned against a wide variety of on-board type of combos. You look at things like Jocasta, Invisible Woman First Steps, or you look at something like Cerebro. They basically can't beat a good Galactus. Like, just can't do it. They don't have that ability. It's so much about distributing power across the rest of the board that you just kind of instantly lose to that card. Again, I'm not saying that this is like a thing that you should be aware of in the sense of like this is going to be a top tier deck, but I do think that this is actually like a pretty meaningful thing, and Galactus is already kind of under the radar, pretty well positioned against some of the stuff that's happening right now. You could see more Galactus as a result of this change. I saved the best for last. White Queen is a card that has almost never, ever been played, which is a shame because Emma Frost is one of the coolest Marvel characters there is. I am genuinely a big fan. And getting her up to 3/5 means that, you know, maybe I'm not going to be playing this card all that much, but the information that you get is relevant as a 3/5. The card you get a little less than relevant some of the time. What I will say is I do think she's still a little bit outshone by something like Mirage, and I'm not necessarily not necessarily sure you want to be playing her in things like V-Hand because that cares so much about cheap stuff. But I can definitely tell you that a few months ago, when people were still able to play Wiccan, I'd be playing this card in Wiccan every single day of the week. I really like a 3/5 body with some information upside on it. It's similar to Copycat, but probably worse. I think this is long overdue. This is a cool character who should have had an on-rate stat line forever ago. Her ability is interesting and dynamic depending on the different... It creates different situations in different games. I'm a huge fan of that. Part of the reason why I'm such a big fan of Moira X is because the card itself is not always the same card depending on what you're playing against or what goes into it. Emma Frost has the same exact kind of dynamic to it. This is just a really cool card that I'm happy to see get an extra point of power. Of all the free points of power distributed, this might not be the most influential, but it is by far my favorite in this OTA. My only complaint, they should change her name to actually be Emma Frost and not White Queen. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one. For my overall thoughts on the patch, not necessarily a nothing burger. I don't think much is changing here. The biggest thing that I learned from this patch was that they are definitely interested in making further changes to the move archetype, and of course that I am under White Queen mind control. I will see you in the next one.